Story 1. My dad was born in rural Texas in 1915. He was the youngest of 10 kids, all a year apart, so his oldest sibling, Henry, was about 11 years older than him. My dad's father died in an accident not long after he was born, so Henry became the man of the house at about age 11. When my dad was about 9 years old, 1924, a gang of men came through their small town, kidnapping children to work as slaves picking cotton about 400 miles away. This was not an unusual occurrence at the time. My dad and two of his siblings were taken. Henry, who was now 18, came home from working on a cattle drive about a week later and found his mother hysterical about the kidnapping of 3 of her children. Being the man of the house, at age 18, Henry strapped on his father's 6 guns, dual holsters, one on each hip, and set out to get his 3 siblings back. He gathered clues about the gang from other townsfolk who also had children stolen. He headed east to where he was pretty certain the kids were taken, riding in empty train boxcars, and even on the roofs of moving trains. It took him several weeks, but through talking to locals along the way, who heard rumors of child abductions, he finally narrowed it down to a few cotton farms where he thought the kids were. My dad, who was 9 years old at the time this happened to him, had tears in his eyes when he told me this part of the story. He and 2 of his brothers, along with about a dozen other kidnapped kids, had been held captive on this cotton ranch for over 2 months and had given up ever seeing a home or the rest of their family again. They were kept locked in a barn, fed scraps, and forced to pick cotton in the hot Texas sun. They were beaten if they cried or refused to work. One day, working in the fields, they heard Henry's voice calling their names. They looked up and saw my uncle, Henry, walking towards them, and they started running toward him when one of their captors rode up on a horse and started yelling. Henry pulled one of his guns and shot the man dead. My dad wasn't even sure if the man had a gun, and it didn't matter. The gunshot drew a couple more of the rancher captors over, and Henry killed them both as well. My dad ran up and hugged my uncle, and he told them, "Let's go home." My dad tells me they rode on and in train boxcars back west to their little Texas town, along with a couple of other kids that were stolen from the town. When they got back to their small farm, my dad said his mom fainted when she saw them. He said Henry put the 6 guns away and never touched them again. There was no law enforcement, no investigation about what had happened, that my uncle murdered 3 men to get his siblings back. It was still the Wild West in Texas in the 1920s. The boys eventually all joined the Army and Navy, and all served and survived World War II. My dad didn't tell me this story until after Henry had died. I had always known my Uncle Henry as a sweet, soft-spoken, diminutive, about 5'4", maybe 100 pounds man, who went on to own a printing shop. I would never have imagined him capable of the feats of heroics he performed at age 18 to bring his family back together. Story 2. I found out 2 years ago that my mother had a baby. She gave up for adoption 18 months before she had me, and then had another baby when I was 3. And she also gave that baby up for adoption. All 3 of us have different fathers, and I think the only reason she kept me was that my father married her. But that marriage only lasted a year. My mother remarried when I was 5, and my half-brother was born when I was 7. As far as I knew, for 59 years, he and I were our mother's only children. I never saw her pregnant with the second baby because she sent me to live with my great-grandparents across the country during her pregnancy. My mother and grandmother were the only people who knew about this, and they both took the secret to their graves. The only reason any of it was found out is because of all of the DNA testing people now do. This discovery impacted my sense of identity for a while, my view of my mother, and our relationship. I've met my half-siblings, an older sister, and a younger brother. I like them, and I'm glad I've been able to answer some of their questions, but the initial discovery messed with me for a bit. I have to work, so I'll try and give some more info, because I can't read everything right now. This happened in the mid-late 1950s. Condoms weren't available to teenagers at the time. There was no sex ed, no abortion, only unwed mother homes. She went to one when she got pregnant with my older sister because she was only 16. I don't know how my mother managed her pregnancy with my brother. She would have been around 21 years old and probably made up some story about a dead husband or divorce or something with the help of her mother. I have never done DNA testing, but the half-siblings have, including the one I grew up with, whom I've always called my brother, not my half-brother. I think they all did Ancestry. The siblings found other relatives first and made their way to me eventually. I don't think I will ever do DNA testing. I'm done with surprises. The other relatives were the ones who told me about the siblings. The story is even wackier because the relatives were my mother's half-sisters, from the father she never met, that she never knew existed. They found me 8 years ago after extensive genealogy research. I also have a half-brother from my bio dad whom I met for the first time right before COVID hit. I've known he existed since I was 19, but wasn't able to find him. He found me. I'm 62 now. My adopted siblings were better off. Both my parents and my stepfather are dead. I don't believe my stepfather ever knew about the adopted babies. I think the only other person who knew was my grandmother. Story 3. For context, my dad is the second youngest of 15 children. My oldest aunt has a son that is around the same age as my dad. We'll call him Vince. Vince and my dad knew each other growing up and always got along. He was even one of my dad's groomsmen. A few years after that, Vince became very openly religious and would try to get family members to go to church with him. The thing the family started to notice is that he would change which church he would go to after about a month. Fast forward to when I was 1. There was a family get-together. Vince and his girlfriend show up. They start making people uncomfortable with their religious talk. Not the normal day-to-day stuff, but telling people they are going to hell for drinking alcohol. Tells people that he is becoming a preacher and they need to attend his services, or else damnation, etc. According to my mom, I was sick at this time, and she took me to another room to give me some quiet, and hopefully, I would stop fussing. She overheard Vince and the GF in the next room talking about who they can single out and would go along with them. My mom freaked when she heard my dad's name, and Vince said that he would be easy to convince, and his job should be able to fund things. My mom immediately went and got my dad and told him what she heard. Dad confronts Vince, and a huge argument ensues. Vince ends up leaving and saying everyone is going to hell, they are Satan, etc. The rest of the family then talked about what happened, and then it all came clear that he was not a good guy. His sister had kicked him out because he was mooching off her, refused to get a job, and she found him stealing from her purse. My aunt had to do the same, for the same reasons. The same story over and over. They realized Vince was just a scam artist trying to live off others. Fast forward to the late 1980s. Not many people have heard from Vince. There is a huge family get-together, and 2 aunts and a few cousins refused to attend because Vince was not welcome. They were saying Vince was the Lion of God, and we are wrong to reject him. Another fight ensues, and the 2 aunts and handful of cousins don't attend. Fast forward to the mid-90s when my grandma had passed away. One of the 2 aunts comes to the funeral, the other passed away a few years earlier, with Vince in tow. Vince was warned that he could come to pay his respects, but to behave himself. My aunt was timid and repressed near him, and was open and nice when he wasn't around. It was really weird. My parents didn't want to talk about it. Later that night, I did some internet searches and found that Vince was the leader of a religious cult. Sucked in my 2 aunts, about 7 of my cousins, and about 30-40 various people through the years. All the same thing. They must give up their money and belongings to join and serve God. He especially preyed on immigrants who came over by themselves. He bought some farmland, his disciples work the land, he sells what they grow make, and keeps the money. He is still active to this day, and many people who have left him have their websites against him. Story 4. My maternal grandfather, luckily he's now dead, was a big-time pedophile and molested all the girls on his side of the family, including his daughter, my mother, from as early as she can remember until her early teen years. My mom told her mother about the abuse as soon as she could articulate it. Rather than doing anything about it, my grandmother started sending my mother into her dad's room to wake him up every morning. Because my grandmother didn't like having sex with him anymore and saw this as an opportunity to pass the buck. When my mom became a teenager, she moved in with her great-grandparents to escape the abuse. Eventually, her parents divorced. My grandmother remarried and wanted to fix her relationship with my mom. She told my mom she was abused by her husband as well. She made it seem like she had no control over the situation and apologized for what my mother went through, promising it would never happen again to anyone else. Fast forward about 10 years, my mom gets married and has 2 daughters of her own. She's rebuilt a relationship with my grandmother and feels like the past is behind her. My mom let my sister and I sleep over at my grandmother's once. I was probably 7, my sister was 4, because she believed that her mother had changed. Rather than letting my sister and I sleep together, my grandmother took my sister to sleep in the spare room and made me sleep in the bed with her new husband. Turns out, my grandmother didn't like having sex with this husband either, and she had a new victim to offer up instead. Luckily, he wasn't a pedophile. That's the nicest thing I can say about him, though. He was a sexist, racist, homophobic piece of shit and is also now dead. But I did find it weird that I had to sleep in the same bed as him, and I complained to my mom the next day that his snoring kept me awake. My mother was livid. She called my grandmother, screamed at her for putting me in a dangerous situation, and we didn't see her for a long time after that. When we did get back in contact, we weren't ever left with my grandmother or her husband unattended. Eventually, my grandmother just kept trying to cross my mom's boundaries, and we cut contact with her altogether. She reaches out to my mom every few years, but my mom just ignores her. Too much damage has been done. Story 5. My story kind of pales in comparison to some of the other stories people have shared here, but just sharing it in brief. As it turns out, my entire immediate family was in on a plot hatched by my mother to have me institutionalized, basically to be put away in a mental institution forever. They made the mistake of documenting their shared plans, which were extremely detailed, and which I eventually was aware of, got hold of due to an email thread containing their in-depth sinister plan to institutionalize me that one of them eventually accidentally copied over to me. For context, I should share I do have epilepsy, though it is controlled, and for people that can have controlled epilepsy, there is never a reason to attempt to institutionalize a person or infringe upon any of the person's rights that anyone in society routinely exercises. And I have a son, so this was my mother's way of attempting to remove my son from my care. Needless to say, it didn't work. I thought about doing TROs, temporary restraining orders, on them, but how does that work for your whole family? In the end, I just had a long, stern conversation with them. Later after that incident, I think it was a few months down the road after I had a conversation with them about their behavior, a police officer knocks on the door, claims that he has had reports of improper care of my son, etc. I invited him in, and it was pretty obvious to him that there was nothing wrong. He couldn't say who the reporting party was, but I suggested it may be my mother, who lives pretty far away, 6+ hours, who goes through various issues of forgetfulness, extreme bouts of attempts to control others, often manifesting in strange, harmful ways. The officer eventually confirmed it was her, and I didn't get any more problems. This was years ago. No problems since that time. I don't think their plans would have gotten very far, but who knows? It seems like people have been put away for not amazing reasons. Story 6. My college professor and uncle had always felt off to me, and I never liked to be alone with them. He was loved by both his students and his peers, and a lot of his Rate Me professors' reviews said he was attractive, even though he was a balding man in his 40s. I'll never forget the day he made his move on me. It was his birthday, and since I happened to be attending the same college he taught at, I was chosen to deliver his gift. I knocked on his office door. He told me it was unlocked, and I entered. What immediately struck me was that for some reason, it was incredibly cold, and I couldn't stop shivering. My uncle was absorbed in something on his computer monitor and didn't seem to notice. He enthusiastically waved me over to his desk. "Come here and take a look at this." When I saw the list on his computer, the only reaction I could muster was my mouth dropping open in shock. Dark family secrets, worst advice you've been given, job interview questions. The list went on and on. My uncle looked at me and smirked before saying in a hushed voice, "Nobody knows this, but I post the same questions on Ask Reddit every single week and I get away with it. There's no moderation for these incredibly common questions, so it's easy karma farming. Then I just sell the account to an astroturfer and move on to the next one." I don't remember much after that besides just knowing that I had to get away. I sprinted as fast as I could out of the room and didn't look back. Thankfully, I dared to be open about my experience, and although I couldn't prove what I had seen, nobody trusted him again. Eventually, the rumors made their way around the college, and his peers lost a lot of respect for him, and his classes are no longer full with a waiting list. Hopefully, he'll be caught red-handed one day, and justice will truly be done. Story 7. My uncle tells the story that when he was a kid, his older brother wanted him to go out hunting with him in the woods near their house. They woke up early and started walking much deeper into the woods than they usually did, and way off the normal trails they used. My uncle realized his brother was letting him get further and further ahead. He stopped and turned around to see his brother starting to bring the shotgun up in his direction. He asked him what the hell was he doing. His brother said, "Oh, I thought I saw something." My uncle decided to go back at that point. Later that week, he went back and found a pit that someone had dug a bit further off the trail. He never went anywhere with his brother alone again. Both of them are Mom's brothers. The wannabe Cain was a narcissist of the not letting a silly thing like being married get in the way of his dating life variety, who decided he had big dreams and bailed on the family and his wife when I was a kid and proceeded to OD. Thus, I usually don't think of him as my uncle because I didn't have a real relationship with him. Not sure why he didn't shoot my uncle. Might have wanted it to look more like an accident, or didn't want to look his brother in the eye. For those saying it's just a story, yeah, I can't prove it since there were only 2 people there, and one of them is dead now, of the aforementioned OD. But the way that my uncle described it, he was really afraid of his brother and thought he was capable of fratricide. Story 8. My father was killed when I was young. My mother couldn't handle me, so I went to live abroad with my father's sister, FS. Fast forward 11 years later, my mom died from cancer. In the 11 years we'd visit and talk, I'd say we were even pretty close at some points. In the final stages of her cancer, my mom was barely functional. Talking about pine cones and Finland, Mom's sister, MS, started talking to me about inheritance and shit like that. I knew my mom wouldn't pull through, but I sure as hell didn't want to worry about what I'm going to inherit before she's dead. Just seems wrong to me. FS warns me to watch out for MS when I was young. She did something that caused a huge rift between my parents, and since then, FS doesn't trust her. FS wouldn't tell me what it was because she didn't want me to have a different view of my parents. When Mom passed, MS didn't want to talk about money or anything related to it and told me to wait with filing for my inheritance. Turns out she had already gone and filed for an inheritance for my grandfather, who was next of kin to my mother, making him eligible like myself. Grandfather was dying of dementia at the time. MS would be his next of kin, which means grandfather's portion of inheritance would go to her once he died. He did just a few weeks after I found out she had filed. Every time she has contacted me, she asked for information that would further her progress in getting a portion of my parents' inheritance. My lawyer is handling this as I'm in a different country and can't be present. The whole situation is fucked because I have very fond memories of MS as a child, and this just made it clear that money will ruin anyone. I finally asked FS about this secret because I need to know who I'm dealing with here and how to proceed. Turns out MS and my father got drunk one day and slept together while Mom and I were home. They had an affair for a while too. I can't fully blame MS because it takes two people to have an affair, but I definitely see her differently now, especially in the light of all the events that transpired.
Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.